Hello again, everyone. I'm Tom Nagorski with the Cipher Brief in our virtual studio for a conversation today about the changes that have gone on in the past couple of weeks. We've been talking a lot about them involving the United States, Ukraine, Russia, Europe, all of that. 2 weeks ago, our guest today, Kori Schake, who is Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, wrote a piece under the heading, quote, "America opens the door to its adversaries." And she wrote that piece before a lot of the things I just alluded to, before the vice president made a speech criticizing the European allies at Munich, before the United States opened negotiations with Russia over the war in Ukraine and did not invite the European allies. And perhaps most, well, I'll let our guest answer this, but one of the more to some troubling incidents was the United States refusing to support a resolution that condemned Russia's aggression in Ukraine. So delighted for all these reasons to have Kori Schake with us here in the Cipher Brief studio. And I suppose, Kori, thanks first of all for being with us. I wonder if you could start with a fundamental question. When you wrote that piece with that headline, did you have any sense that this is where we were going, or that these were the developments we'd be talking about just 2 short weeks later?
Well, the direction of travel was clear. The speed and the destination were still shocking, and we're probably not done with the shameful conceding to the aggressor Ukraine's interests and
Mhm.
Europe's broader security. I mean, it's genuinely shocking. I don't think any American president in the last 80 years would have thought about this conflict in the way Donald Trump is thinking about this conflict, which is completely neutral between the aggressor, Russia, and the victim, Ukraine.
What do you think is, if there is a strategy here? I mean, what do you think the Trump administration's strategy, whatever one thinks of the statements and the policies themselves, what's the game here? What's the strategy?
Well, to the extent there is a strategy, and I'm not persuaded that there actually is. I'm not persuaded that there's anything beyond the narcissism of President Trump wanting a big, lots of attention, all the international media focused on him and Vladimir Putin, making deals over the heads of America's friends and allies. So I'm not convinced there is a strategy, but if I were trying to grab a strategy out of the president's actions, what I would say is that he is trying to bully the Ukrainians into making concessions that Russia would accept. The problem is, of course, I can't think of terms that any Ukrainian government, not just the Zelensky government, could offer that would slake Russia's thirst. Because what Russia's fearful of, what Putin is fearful of, is positive change in Ukraine, a desire by Ukrainians for accountable government and freedom and prosperity that Vladimir Putin fears Russians will begin to demand for themselves. And so what he is asking for is the extermination of Ukraine as a separate entity, as a culture, as a history, in any way distinct from Russia's.
Recognizing excellence in national security, the Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
Now, we're speaking just shortly before a trip that President Zelensky is going to make to Washington. On the face of it, it is to finalize this deal over rare earth minerals that has gotten a lot of attention. What puts you in another odd position if you were advising Mr. Zelensky on, he has made a lot of dramatic visits to Washington in the 3 years of this war, but this is a different kind of drama. What would you suggest or advise him in terms of a case to be made at this point, given all the things you just said?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the case I would make for the government of Ukraine is that President Trump doesn't want to go down in history as destroying 80 years of successful American foreign policy.
Hmm.
Because I do think in the first Trump administration, when people like Secretary Mattis and White House Chief of Staff John Kelly were arguing that the president shouldn't abandon Afghanistan, that the argument that you don't want to be associated with the fall of Saigon in our time did get traction with President Trump in the first term. But I think President Trump in the second term, and after surviving the assassination attempt and surviving 2 impeachment efforts, feels emboldened in a way that's actually making him much more reckless than he was in his first term.
Hmm. And what are, you made the point that the Ukrainians may not be able to accept uh, whatever the deal that is on the table or is put forward in these discussions. Um, that would then suggest that a war keeps going. At least the Ukrainians keep fighting. How did the developments of the last couple of weeks and a potential, because nothing has really happened yet, right, erosion of American support, how will that impact uh, the battlefield and the war zone from a Ukrainian standpoint?
Well, if the United States ceases to support Ukraine's war effort politically, economically, and militarily, I do not think Ukraine will stop fighting, but they won't be able to protect their civilian populations. You know, the air defenses that Germany and the United States are providing have been essential for the protection of Ukraine's major cities.
Hmm.
And so there will be more Ukrainian civilian deaths if the United States ceases to supply. And there will be a lot less Ukrainian weapons on the battlefield. But I don't think that will prevent Ukraine from continuing to fight, because they've seen what life under Russian occupation is like in the areas Russia has conquered of the country, the
Hmm.
depredations and the war crimes. I just don't see Ukraine voluntarily subjecting themselves to that. What
Hmm.
I think will happen, though, is that you'll have to see either a rush to greater support from European countries, from South Korea, from Japan, from Australia, to try and get them weapons to continue to fight large scale military forces attacking other military forces. I also think another consequence will be everything will get more difficult for the United States, because our European allies will be focused solely on trying to salvage their own security and protect Ukraine. And that means they will not be willing or able to help the United States for anything we're interested in doing in the world.
You've taken me to where I was going to go next, Corey, in terms of other beyond the Ukraine war ripple effects, potential impact or damage, what have you, of the things that have gone on in the last few weeks. A lot of people, I think, even some pretty sophisticated, smart ones, don't quite understand the benefits of the transatlantic alliance and of so flesh out a little bit, if you could, what you referred to when you talk about needs that the United States may have from its longtime partners and allies in Europe that may come into play now.
What our allies give us is strategic depth, the ability to see threats at a distance as they are gathering and growing in strength, and to be able to deal with them where they are growing before they become a problem for American citizens. That's an enormous advantage the United States has had for the last 80 years. A second major advantage is the prosperity that comes with peace in Europe. I mean, Europeans are the largest investors in the American economy, and vice versa. So our prosperity is inextricably linked to that of Europeans. But the third thing is, these are our actual friends. These are the people who likewise constitute governments that are responsive to their people, that are respectful of human dignity and freedom. And we actually should care a lot more than President Trump is sounding like he cares about that. And I guess the last thing is there is honor in standing beside people who are fighting for their freedom.
Mm-hmm.
We are a different kind of country if we become indifferent to the advance or retreat of liberty in the world.
Mm-hmm. Now, I said a moment ago that it's really been 2 weeks or so of remarkable statements in terms of the pivot, some actions like that UN vote, but a lot of, it portends certain things rather than actual things having happened. Do you think there's a chance that some of this gets reversed, that this is a bit of a bump in the road? And I'll just throw out one thought here. We are not even a month removed from the president's statement and proposal to take ownership of Gaza. Far from what we're talking about, it does appear that because of the response from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and so forth, that's gone either to the back burner. The president sounded a little more, all of which is to say, is there a chance that this takes a bit of a U-turn too, or do you think the damage has been done?
Well, I think generational damage has already been done by what the president has said. He has called into question whether the United States is a reliable security partner for countries whose independence relies on that. And that's going to take a generation to rebuild, if in fact we can even rebuild it.
Mm-hmm.
But you're quite right that statements aren't as damaging as actions. The forced surrender of Ukraine, or an agreement the United States makes over Ukraine's head that surrenders its liberty, that would be just devastating. And not just for Ukraine and not just for the security of Europe, but, Singapore's prime minister is already publicly talking about the different landscape in Asia now that the United States is no longer a reliable security partner.
Mm-hmm.
So boats are rocking just from the statements. I'm a little bit, hopeful is too strong a word, but I'm a little bit anticipating that there won't be a Ukraine deal because Vladimir Putin won't make one. Because I think he actually wants the extinction of Ukraine, not just the surrender while he repairs his army to conquer it further at a later date. So I think with tragic irony, we may be saved from the bad choices of our own government by the bad choices of one of the worst governments in the world.
Interesting. So in other words, war goes on, which is not a good thing, but some of the other things you're talking about are mitigated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So last question then, Corey, is in a way you've half answered it, but do you think history will look back at these, just a few weeks in the beginning of 2025 as a kind of, the way 1989 was in the revolutions, 1945? Is it that kind of a sort of tectonic change we're witnessing? Or do you think, as I said earlier, more of a bump in the road?
I do think it has the potential to be a tectonic change. But again, this is 5 weeks of mostly talking, not action. And whether the courts and the Congress, the two other co-equal branches of American government, restrict the president's freedom of action, whether Congress begins to exercise its Article 1 constitutional authorities rather than let the president run roughshod over them, I think will have a lot to do with whether this becomes a real turning point and the end of the American-led order, or whether it becomes just a bump in the road, a tumultuous beginning to an ultimately inconsequential presidency.
Wow. That's a big statement. You've made many. Well, we're going to have to end it there. Corey Shockey, thank you so much for joining us from the American Enterprise Institute. We really appreciate your insights and your time. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.